The bar was called the Celestial Watering Hole. It sat on a space station far from Earth, a place where aliens from many different worlds came to drink and talk. The air inside worked for everyone. The gravity felt normal for all species. It was one of those rare places in the galaxy where nobody had to wear a special suit or breathing mask. Jake Martinez sat alone at the far end of the long metal bar. He was human, one of the few in this part of space. In front of him sat a glass of something the bartender called whiskey, but it tasted nothing like the whiskey from Earth. It burned his throat and made him cough. He drank it anyway. It was better than sitting in his small cargo ship alone. Jake worked as a cargo hauler. He moved boxes and containers from one planet to another. The pay was decent. The work was boring, but it kept him fed and his ship running. He had been doing this job for 3 years now, ever since Earth joined the big Galactic Trade Organization. In that time, he had learned many important lessons about surviving in space bars. The most important lesson was simple. Keep your head down. Drink your drink. Do not talk to anyone unless they talk to you first. And most importantly, do not get involved in alien arguments. Ever. Tonight, Jake reminded himself of this lesson as he watched the bar fill up with customers. There were Throdian merchants with their scaly skin and 4 arms. There were Morphean engineers whose bodies shifted between liquid and gas. There were Gelthian scholars who looked like floating jellyfish made of crystal. There were Corvan soldiers, huge and covered in armor that looked like beetle shells. Each species spoke a different language, but everyone wore a small translator device. The devices turned their words into Galactic Standard, a language that all the trading species used. Jake wore one too. It clipped onto his ear and felt uncomfortable, but it worked well enough. The trouble started at the center table. A Throdian merchant named Vexthor was talking loudly. He liked to hear himself speak. Throdians were known for this. They loved to debate and argue about everything. Philosophy, science, art, politics. If there was a topic, a Throdian would have an opinion about it. Tonight, Vexthor was surrounded by other aliens who were listening to him talk. His scales shimmered under the bar lights as he gestured with all 4 of his arms. His voice came through loud and clear over the translator. He said something that made Jake groan quietly into his drink. The Throdian was talking about water. Specifically, he was talking about whether water was wet or not. Jake had heard this argument before. Back on Earth, late at night in college dorms and internet forums, people would argue about this exact question. The debates never ended well. People got angry. Friendships broke, and nobody ever changed their mind. Vexthor spoke with absolute confidence. He said that water could not be wet. His logic was simple. Wetness was something that water did to other things. When water touched a towel, the towel became wet. When water touched skin, the skin became wet. But water itself could not make itself wet. Therefore, water was not wet. It sounded reasonable. But Jake knew what was coming next. He had seen this argument play out too many times. A Morphean engineer named Crix bubbled with disagreement. His body rippled and shifted as he spoke. He said that Vexthor was wrong. Water molecules touched other water molecules. They surrounded each other. By Vexthor's own logic, that meant water made water wet. So water must be wet? Jake took another sip of his terrible whiskey. He kept his eyes on his glass. This was not his problem. This was not his argument. He was just here to drink and then go back to his ship. But the argument was growing. A Gelthian scholar drifted over to the table. It spoke with a voice that sounded like music, but the words were sharp. The Gelthian said that both of them were wrong. Wetness was just a feeling, a way that some species experienced water touching them. The Gelthian species had 17 different words for what others called wet. Each word described a different type of molecular interaction. The Gelthian said that the whole argument was stupid. Without a proper definition of wetness, there could be no answer. Vexthor did not like being called stupid. His scales changed color, shifting to a darker shade. He told the Gelthian that crystal beings like them could not understand simple binary logic. Wet or not wet? It was easy. The Gelthian made everything complicated because their brains worked in complicated ways. Then Vexthor said something that Jake knew would cause real problems. The Throdian said that Gelthian species were so bad at simple thinking that they never invented faster-than-light travel on their own. They had to buy the technology from other species. The temperature in the bar seemed to drop. The Gelthian started glowing with angry colors. Even Jake, who did not know much about Gelthian body language, could tell that the floating crystal being was very insulted. Crix the Morphean tried to calm everyone down. He made soothing bubbling sounds and said they should all discuss this rationally. They were intelligent beings. They could debate without fighting, but the damage was done. The Gelthian turned its attention to Crix. It said that a being who could not even maintain a consistent physical form had no right to talk about rational discussion. The Gelthian said that Crix's opinions were as unstable as his molecular bonds. Now Crix was insulted too. His form rippled with agitation. He puffed up larger, taking in more air, which was how Morpheans showed anger. Jake noticed the bartender moving. The old Quelxian who ran the bar had 6 eyes and had probably seen 1,000 bar fights. He was quietly taking the expensive bottles off the top shelf and putting them in a safe place below the bar. That was never a good sign. More aliens were gathering around the table now. Everyone had an opinion about water and wetness. A few were trying to support Vexthor. Others agreed with Crix. Some thought the Gelthian was right. The voices were getting louder. Jake finished his drink and pushed his glass forward slightly. The bartender saw the gesture and understood. He poured Jake another drink without saying anything. The bartender was smart. He knew that if this turned into a real fight, at least one person would stay calm and out of the way. That person was Jake. The argument continued to grow. More species joined in. Everyone was absolutely certain they were correct. Nobody was listening to anyone else, and it was all about a simple question that nobody could answer. Was water wet? Jake sat at his spot at the bar and watched. He had no intention of joining this debate. He had no intention of taking sides. He was just going to sit here, drink his drink, and wait for either the argument to end or for things to get violent enough that he needed to leave. Based on his experience with alien bars, he suspected it would be the second option. The voices were getting angrier. The insults were getting more personal, and everyone was too proud to back down. Jake took a long sip of his whiskey and settled in to watch what would happen next. It was not his problem. It was not his fight. He was just a human cargo hauler trying to have a quiet drink. Whatever was about to happen, he planned to stay completely out of it. Within minutes, the debate had spread across the entire bar. What started as a conversation between 3 aliens had now pulled in dozens of different species. Everyone wanted to share their opinion. Everyone was certain they were right. And everyone was talking over each other. A Corvan battle commander joined the argument. His name was Brexthal, and he was built like a living tank. His body was covered in thick chitinous armor that looked like it could stop bullets. His mandibles clicked together as he spoke, a sound that the translator turned into words. Brexthal slammed one massive claw on the table. The whole thing shook. He declared that water was obviously wet. Any soldier knew this simple fact. When water touched you, you became wet. Therefore, water itself must be wet. It was basic combat logic, simple and clear. Bexthor's scales rippled with indignation. The Throdian merchant turned to face the Corvan commander. He said that combat logic had no place in a discussion about physics and philosophy. This was a matter for thinking beings, not warriors who solved everything with force. The bar went quiet for a moment. Calling a Corvan commander a mindless warrior was a serious insult. Corvans took great pride in their military traditions. They believed that warfare was an art form that required intelligence and strategy. One of Brexthal's soldiers stood up from a nearby table. He was almost as large as his commander. His voice was a low rumble that Jake could feel through the floor. The soldier asked if Vexthor was calling Commander Brexthal a brute. More Corvan soldiers started paying attention. There were at least 6 of them in the bar. They all stopped drinking and turned to watch the argument. Their armor gleamed under the lights. Jake caught the bartender's eye. The Quelxian nodded slightly and poured Jake another drink without being asked. They both knew what was about to happen. The bartender had probably seen this exact situation 100 times before. A synthoid unit rolled up to the debating group. It was a robot, all metal and circuits with glowing optical sensors for eyes. Its designation was X7 Prime. It spoke in a mechanical voice that somehow managed to sound condescending. X7 Prime said that the answer was simple mathematics. Wetness was a measure of hydrogen bonding strength at a molecular surface. Water molecules had hydrogen bonds with each other. Therefore, water possessed the property called wetness. This could be calculated and proven with numbers. Bexthor turned on the synthoid immediately. He said that machines could not understand philosophical nuance. Synthoids could only calculate numbers. They could not truly think or understand the deeper meaning of concepts like wetness. X7. Prime's optical sensors changed from blue to red. In synthoid body language, this meant anger. The robot moved closer to Bexthor. Its mechanical hands opened and closed in what looked like a threatening gesture. A small furry creature climbed onto a chair. It was a planari, a species that looked like a cross between a cat and a spider. It had 6 legs and 6 eyes. Despite being small, planari were known to be brave and quick to anger. The planari spoke in a high-pitched voice. It said that everyone was wrong. On the planari homeworld, there were 3 types of water. Clear water was not wet. Heavy water was wet, and sacred water transcended the concept of wetness entirely. The planari said that these outsiders were arguing about something they did not fully understand. Crix the Morphean made a dismissive, bubbling sound. He said that the planari homeworld had a primitive civilization that had not even reached space travel on its own. What could they possibly know about molecular physics and the nature of water? The planari's fur stood straight up. All 6 of its eyes narrowed to angry slits. Its small paws reached for something on its belt. Jake recognized the shape. It was a sonic disruptor, a weapon that could shatter bones from 10 paces away. The planari might be small, but it was clearly ready to fight. The crowd in the bar was growing larger. More aliens were drawn to the argument. Some came from other tables. Others had just entered the bar and were immediately pulled into the debate. Each new participant added their own opinion and their own cultural perspective on water and wetness. A hexal waddled over in its containment suit. Hexals breathed methane, not oxygen, so they had to wear special suits when visiting stations like this. The hexal's voice came through its suit's vocoder, crackling with static. It said that in a methane atmosphere like its homeworld, water was solid ice. How could a solid be wet? The whole question was meaningless because it depended on the environment. What was wet in one place might not be wet in another. The Gelthian scholar responded coldly. It said that everything was environment dependent. That was obvious. But if they were discussing standard pressure oxygen environments, then clearly water should be considered dry. Wetness was a comparative state. Water was only wet when compared to things that were not water. Bexthor demanded to know what water was being compared to. The Gelthian said non-water substances. Crix jumped back in and said that water was a non-water substance to itself. Individual water molecules were separate from other water molecules so they could make each other wet. The logic was going in circles. The arguments were becoming more complex and more confusing. But nobody was backing down. Nobody was willing to admit they might be wrong. Everyone was absolutely convinced that their understanding of water and wetness was the correct one. Jake watched the chaos unfold. He had finished his 2nd drink and was now working on his 3rd. The alcohol was starting to make everything feel distant and dreamlike. But even through the slight buzz, he could see the warning signs clearly. The Corvan soldiers were moving into defensive positions around their commander. The Synthoid X7 Prime was calculating attack angles, its head swiveling to track multiple targets at once. The Planari's paw was still on its sonic disruptor. The Gelthian was glowing brighter, which meant it was channeling energy for either defense or offense. More species had joined the argument. There were Yarthian miners who worked in the asteroid fields. There were Scalix merchants who traded in rare minerals. There were Hyphon diplomats whose tentacles waved in agitation. Each group was defending their own position about water and wetness. The voices were getting louder. The insults were getting more personal. Species were insulting other species. Old grievances were being brought up. Past wars and conflicts were being mentioned. What had started as a philosophical debate was turning into something much more dangerous. Jake had seen enough bar fights across the galaxy to recognize when things were about to explode. The tension in the room was thick. Everyone was on edge. All it would take was one wrong word, one small push, and the entire situation would erupt into violence. He took another sip of his drink and made sure he was sitting on the outside edge of his bar stool. If he needed to move quickly, he wanted to be ready. His ship was docked not far from here. He could be there in 5 minutes if he ran, but for now he stayed put. He watched. He listened to the argument spiral out of control. And he kept his mouth shut, because Jake Martinez had learned the most important rule of surviving in alien bars. When everyone around you is being stupid, the smartest thing you can do is nothing at all. The argument reached a fever pitch. Aliens were shouting over each other. Some were standing on tables to be heard. Others were pushing closer to the center of the debate. The bartender had given up trying to serve drinks. He was just standing behind his bar with his arms crossed, waiting for the inevitable. And then, just as Jake knew it would, someone threw the first punch. Commander Brexthal threw the first punch, but he did not aim it at Vexthor or any of the main debaters. A Scalix merchant happened to be walking past the table carrying a tray of drinks. The merchant laughed at something the Corvin commander said. It was not a loud laugh, but it was enough. Brexthal swung his massive claw without thinking. The punch was meant for the Scalix, but the merchant was quick. He ducked under the swing. The commander's claw kept going and smashed into the Hexal's containment suit instead. Fortunately, the suit held. It did not crack or break, but the impact sent the Hexal flying backward. The methane-breathing alien crashed into a table where 3 Yarthian miners were sitting and drinking. The Yarthians were big, hairy creatures with short tempers, especially when they had been drinking. They assumed the Hexal had attacked them on purpose. One of them stood up and roared. Then he picked up his plate of food and threw it at the Corvin soldiers. The food splattered across Brexthal's armor. Pieces of some unidentifiable alien meat dripped down his chest plate. The commander looked down at himself. Then he looked at the Yarthian miners. His mandibles clicked together in rage. That was when the bar erupted into complete chaos. The Corvin soldiers charged at the Yarthian table. The Yarthians grabbed chairs and bottles to defend themselves. Other aliens scattered to get out of the way. Some were not fast enough and got caught in the middle of the fight. Crix the Morphean tried to escape by turning into gas. His body began to dissolve into a cloud of vapor. But someone had damaged a cooling unit during the initial chaos. Cold air blasted out from a broken vent. The cold air hit Crix's gaseous form and partially solidified him. He ended up stuck between liquid and gas, unable to move properly. The Gelthian scholar floated up toward the ceiling, trying to stay above the violence, but it was broadcasting angry telepathic static. Everyone with telepathic sensitivity grabbed their heads in pain. This included several species that had been trying to stay neutral. Now they were angry too. Vexthor found himself surrounded. The Throatian merchant was still shouting that water was not wet. He used all 4 of his arms to push away aliens who were trying to hit him. His scales changed colors rapidly, flashing through warning patterns. The Synthoid X7 Prime moved with mechanical precision. Its optical sensors tracked multiple targets at once. It calculated the optimal path through the chaos and began systematically defending itself. A Yarthian swung a chair at the robot. X7 Prime caught the chair in midair, analyzed its structural weaknesses, and broke it into pieces with one swift motion. The small Planari was causing more damage than anyone expected. Despite being tiny, the furry creature wielded its sonic disruptor with deadly accuracy. It fired at targets without hesitation. The weapon made a high-pitched whine that hurt Jake's ears even from across the bar. Chairs exploded into splinters. Tables cracked down the middle. At least one Throatian merchant went down, clutching his head. Furniture flew through the air. Drinks splashed everywhere. The lights flickered as someone crashed into a power junction. Alien blood of various colors started staining the floor. Green, purple, blue, and one shade that looked almost black. And through all of this, Jake Martinez sat at his spot at the bar. He calmly sipped his whiskey. He watched the violence unfold around him with the detached interest of someone watching a sporting event. When a chair flew toward his head, he leaned to the side without even looking. The chair smashed into the wall behind him. The bartender had activated emergency shields around his bottles and equipment. Clear energy barriers hummed to life, protecting the most valuable items in the bar. The Quelxian looked at Jake and shook his head. At least one person in this bar had common sense. A Quelxian waiter ran past Jake's position. The waiter was being chased by an angry Hyphon whose tentacles were flailing in every direction. The Hyphon was still shouting about water and wetness even while attacking someone. The waiter gasped as he ran by Jake. He asked why the human was not helping. Why was Jake just sitting there? Did he not see that the bar was being destroyed? Jake took another calm sip of his drink. He said that this was not his circus and these were not his monkeys. It was an Earth saying. It meant that this situation was not his problem. The waiter looked confused. He asked what monkeys were. Then he yelped as a tentacle wrapped around his ankle. The Hyphon pulled him back into the chaos. Jake turned his attention back to his drink. The fighting had spread to every corner of the bar now. Aliens who had not been part of the original argument were now involved. Old rivalries between species were coming out. Political disputes were being settled with fists, and somehow people were still arguing about whether water was wet. A Chronite warrior charged through the room. Chronites were built like armored rhinoceroses that walked on two legs. This particular Chronite was bellowing about honor and proper scientific method. He crashed through tables and chairs like they were made of paper. Someone released a cloud of biochemical irritant. It was probably an accident, but the result was immediate. Half the species in the bar started coughing and sneezing. Eyes watered. Breathing passages closed up. The fighting became even more chaotic as aliens stumbled around blind and choking. Jake ducked as another projectile sailed over his head. This time it was an actual bottle. It smashed against the wall, spraying liquid everywhere. He checked his jacket to make sure none of the liquid had gotten on him. The jacket was clean. Good. The Gelthian scholar was still floating near the ceiling. It broadcast another telepathic message to everyone in the room. The message said that they were all fools. Their violence proved nothing except their collective ignorance about basic physics and philosophy. Commander Brexthal heard this message. He looked up at the floating crystal being. He grabbed a table with both claws and lifted it above his head. Then he threw the entire table at the Gelthian. The Gelthian dodged easily. The table flew across the room and crashed through one of the large viewport screens. The screen showed a view of the stars outside the station. When the table hit it, the screen shattered. Emergency alarms started blaring immediately. Red warning lights flashed throughout the bar. An automated voice announced that there was a hull breach. Emergency atmospheric seals activated. Heavy metal barriers started sliding down over the damaged viewport. For a moment, the fighting paused. Everyone looked at the damaged viewport and the emergency barriers. They realized that they had actually caused serious damage to the station. This was no longer just a bar fight. This was a safety incident. Then someone shouted that water was definitely wet. Someone else shouted back that water was not wet. And the fighting started again, even more intense than before. Jake finished his third drink. He set the empty glass down carefully on the bar. He caught the bartender's eye and shook his head slightly. The bartender understood. No more drinks. It was time to think about leaving. But Jake did not leave yet. He stayed in his seat watching the chaos, waiting to see what would happen next. Station security would arrive soon. They always did. When they came, the real show would begin, and Jake wanted to see how this ended. He was still not getting involved. He was still not taking sides. He was just a human cargo hauler having a drink in a bar. Whatever these aliens wanted to fight about was their business. Jake knew better than to get between angry aliens arguing about water. That was a fight nobody could win. Station security arrived 7 minutes after the first punch was thrown. That was actually good response time considering how large Crosspoint 9 station was. The security team had to travel from the central hub, which was on the opposite side of the station from the bar district. The security captain was named Errol Knox. She was a Quantix, a species that evolved from pack-hunting predators. Quantix were known for being direct, efficient, and completely without patience for stupid behavior. Captain Errol Knox had a reputation. She did not tolerate nonsense. She walked into the destroyed bar with her sonic weapon charged and ready. Behind her, a dozen security officers in full riot gear fanned out across the room. They moved with practiced precision, blocking exits and establishing control zones. Captain Errol Knox raised one clawed hand. Her voice cut through the noise like a blade. She commanded everyone to freeze. The tone of her voice made it clear that this was not a request. This was an order. Anyone who disobeyed would regret it. The fighting slowly ground to a halt. Aliens froze in mid-punch. Commander Brexthal lowered the chair he had been about to throw. The Plenary reluctantly deactivated its sonic disruptor. The Gelthian scholar descended from the ceiling, its crystal body dimming to a less aggressive color. Crix the Morphean finally managed to stabilize his form back to mostly liquid. He pooled on the floor looking exhausted. Vexthor stood among the wreckage of several tables, all four of his arms hanging at his sides. Everyone looked guilty, angry, or in some cases both. Captain Errol Knox surveyed the damage with the weary expression of someone who had seen this exact situation too many times. Her eyes swept across the broken furniture, the shattered screens, the stains on the walls and floor. Then she spoke. She said that she was going to guess what happened. Someone asked if water was wet. Her voice was flat and completely devoid of humor. The bar fell into guilty silence. Nobody wanted to admit that she was correct. But nobody could deny it either. The evidence was clear. This was exactly what had happened. Rel Knox pinched the bridge of her snout, a gesture that looked very similar to a human expressing frustration. She said that this was the third time this month. Did these people not know that the water wetness debate was a banned topic in all Crosspoint 9 establishments? There were signs posted. There were regulations. There were warnings in 300 different languages. Vexthor tried to speak. He said that this was a matter of scientific importance. The pursuit of knowledge should not be restricted by arbitrary rules. Truth was more important than peace. Captain Irel Knox interrupted him immediately. She said that truth was less important than paying for damages. Everyone involved in the fight would be charged. Fines for disturbing the peace, fines for property destruction, fines for unlawful discharge of energy weapons, fines for public endangerment, fines for triggering station emergency systems. The security officers started moving through the crowd, taking statements and scanning identification chips. Each alien was asked their name, their species, and their account of what happened. The datapad screens glowed as information was recorded. One of the security officers approached Jake. The officer was a Vathian, tall and thin with too many joints in his arms and legs. He held up a datapad and asked for Jake's name and identification. Jake gave his information calmly. Jake Martinez, freelance cargo hauler, registered with Earth's merchant fleet. He provided his identification number. The officer scanned Jake's ID chip with the datapad. The officer looked at his screen. Then he looked at Jake with surprise. According to the bar's sensor logs, Jake had been sitting in that exact spot for the last 23 minutes. The sensors tracked all movement in the bar for security purposes. Jake's position had not changed at all during the entire incident. The officer asked if this was correct. Jake confirmed that it was. The officer asked if Jake participated in the altercation. Jake said no. The officer asked if Jake defended himself at any point. Jake said no again. He explained that defending yourself required first being attacked. He was not attacked because he was not involved. The officer stared at Jake for a long moment. His multiple eyes blinked in sequence, which was a sign of confusion in his species. He seemed unable to process the concept of someone staying completely neutral during a bar fight. Finally, he made a note on his datapad and moved on to interview the next patron. Captain Irel Knox noticed Jake sitting at the bar. She approached him with interest. Her predatory eyes studied him carefully. She asked if he was human. Jake confirmed that he was. Irel Knox nodded slowly. She said that humans were relatively new to the Galactic Commerce Guild. Earth had only joined a few years ago. Most species in the galaxy did not know much about humans yet. She asked how Jake managed to avoid getting drawn into the fight. Everyone else in the bar had participated in some way. Some fought actively. Others were caught in the crossfire. But Jake just sat there through the whole thing. Jake thought about how to explain this. Then he remembered an old saying from Earth. He told the captain that where he came from, people said you should never wrestle with a pig. You both get dirty and the pig likes it. Irel Knox's translator took a moment to process the idiom. It was a metaphor, which translators sometimes struggled with. But when the meaning came through, the captain's expression changed. A sound escaped her throat that might have been a laugh. She said that was wisdom. Real wisdom. Not the false wisdom of species who thought they knew everything. She said that maybe humans would do well in the galaxy after all. The galaxy needed more beings who knew when not to fight. Jake thanked her. Irel Knox nodded and moved on to supervise her officers. She was shouting at Vexthor now, demanding to know why a supposedly intelligent merchant would risk his trading license over a question about water. The security team worked efficiently. They took statements from everyone. They documented all the damage. They collected evidence. Several aliens were placed in restraints because they tried to start fighting again, even with security present. The Plenary in particular had to be physically restrained because it kept reaching for its weapon. Medical teams arrived to treat the injured. Most injuries were minor. Bruises, cuts, one broken arm on a Scalix merchant. The Morphean engineer Crix needed his molecular stabilizer recalibrated because the cold air had damaged his ability to control his form properly. The bartender was talking to an insurance assessor, a gray-skinned Quelxian who looked bored by the whole situation. The assessor took pictures of the damage with a scanner device. The bartender kept pointing at different destroyed items and explaining how expensive they were. Jake stayed in his seat. Nobody told him to leave. The security officer had cleared him of any wrongdoing. He was free to go whenever he wanted, but he was curious to see how this would end. So he stayed and watched. Eventually, Captain Knox announced the total fines. The amount was staggering. 35,000 credits split among all the participants. The Corvin soldiers would pay the most because they had caused the most damage. But everyone who threw a punch or fired a weapon would pay something. There were groans and complaints. Vexthor tried to argue that he was merely defending himself. Knox cut him off. She said that starting a fight by insulting someone's species' intelligence did not count as self-defense. He would pay his fine or spend time in a detention cell. His choice. The security team began escorting aliens out of the bar. Most were sent back to their ships or quarters with orders to pay their fines within 24 hours. A few, like the Plenari who kept trying to attack people, were taken to detention for the night. Jake finished watching the security team work. Then he stood up from his bar stool. His legs were a bit stiff from sitting so long. He stretched and prepared to leave. The bartender called out to him as he headed for the door. The Quelxian bartender said that Jake's drinks were on the house tonight. Anyone smart enough to stay out of a fight about water and wetness deserved free drinks. Jake thanked him and walked out into the station corridor. Behind him, the bar was being cleaned by repair drones. The night's violence was ending, but Jake knew that somewhere else on the station, someone was probably starting the same argument all over again. That was just how things worked in the galaxy. 2 hours had passed since the fight ended. Most of the aliens involved had been sent away by station security. The medical teams had treated the injured and left. The repair drones were still working, but they had made good progress. The celestial watering hole was starting to look like a bar again instead of a war zone. Jake was one of the few patrons allowed to stay. The bartender had given him permission to remain while the cleaning was finished. They sat together at the newly repaired bar, both of them tired but relieved that the night was finally ending. The bartender was working on his data pad, calculating the total damages. His 6 eyes moved rapidly as he added up numbers. Finally, he set the data pad down and muttered to himself, 30,000 credits in damages, all because of an argument about whether water was wet. Jake offered some perspective. He said it could have been worse. At least nobody died. Bar fights in space could be deadly when so many different species with different weapons were involved. This time everyone survived. That was something. The bartender made a dismissive sound with his throat. He said that the only reason nobody died was because Corvins had thick skulls, and Gelthians did not have physical bodies that could be damaged. If the fight had involved more fragile species, the death toll could have been significant. He looked at Jake with curiosity. He said that humans were strange. Every other species on the station would have joined the fight. Some would fight because they believed in their position. Others would fight just for the excitement. But Jake just sat there and watched like it was entertainment on a screen. Jake thought about how to explain human history. He said that back on Earth, humanity had thousands of years to learn hard lessons. People fought wars over religion. They fought over politics. They fought over which way toilet paper should hang on the roll. Humans had fought over things even less important than whether water was wet. The bartender asked if humans learned wisdom through suffering. Was that how Earth's species developed this unusual perspective? Jake nodded. Something like that. Humans learned to pick their battles carefully. They learned that just because you could argue about something did not mean you should. Some arguments had no winners. Some debates had no right answers. The smart thing was to recognize those situations and stay out of them. The bartender seemed to understand this. He nodded his large head slowly. Then Jake said something that made the bartender's eyes widen with interest. Jake said that he actually knew the answer to the water question. Several nearby patrons who had been pretending not to listen suddenly became very attentive. A repair drone paused in its work. Even the air in the bar seemed to still. The bartender leaned forward carefully. He asked if Jake really knew whether water was wet or not. His voice was cautious, like he was afraid of triggering another fight. Jake confirmed that he did know. The bartender asked him to share this knowledge. What was the answer? Was water wet or was it not wet? Jake stood up from his bar stool. He stretched his back, which was sore from sitting for so long. Then he pulled out his credit chip to pay for his drinks. He told the bartender that yes, he knew the answer, but he also knew that telling anyone would start another fight, and he had a cargo run to prepare for. He needed to get back to his ship. He paid his tab and added a generous tip for the bartender's trouble. The Quelxian accepted the payment with a mixture of gratitude and frustration. He clearly wanted to know the answer, but he also understood Jake's reasoning. Jake headed for the door. Behind him, he could already hear the whispers starting. Did the human really know the answer? Why would he not share it? Was water wet or not? The speculation was beginning. Voices were rising in debate once again. By the time Jake reached the corridor outside the bar, he could hear the familiar sounds of argument. Someone was insisting water was definitely wet. Someone else was insisting water was definitely not wet. The debate was resuming with renewed energy. Jake smiled to himself and headed toward the docking bay. He thought about how humans had survived for so long. They survived by knowing when to fight. They survived by knowing when to run. But most importantly, they survived by knowing when to just sit back and watch others destroy themselves over nothing. As he walked through the station corridors, Jake heard a loud crash behind him. Then he heard raised voices and the wail of security alarms starting again. The debate had apparently escalated into violence once more. The exact same argument that caused the first fight was causing a second one. Jake chuckled quietly to himself. He quickened his pace toward the docking bay. He muttered the old earth saying under his breath, "Not his circus, not his monkeys." These aliens could argue about water for the rest of their lives if they wanted. He had better things to do. His ship was waiting in docking bay 7. It was called the Wandering Star. The ship was not fast. It was not new. The paint was chipped in several places, and one of the rear thrusters made a concerning noise during startup. But it was paid for and it belonged to him. More importantly, it was far away from philosophical debates about water. Jake climbed aboard and sealed the airlock behind him. The familiar smell of his ship greeted him. Oil, recycled air, and the faint scent of the protein bars he lived on during long hauls. It was not pleasant, but it was home. He strapped himself into the pilot's seat and began running through pre-flight checks. The systems came online one by one. Navigation, life support, engines, communications. Everything was functioning normally. The ship was ready to leave. As he worked, Jake reflected on the evening's events. Humanity had only been part of the galactic community for a few short years. In that time, they had not made a name for themselves through military strength. Earth's weapons were not the most advanced. They had not become known for their intelligence. Other species were smarter. They had not become famous for their technology. Many alien civilizations were thousands of years ahead of Earth. No, humans were becoming known for something else entirely. Something that was perhaps more valuable in a galaxy filled with 1,000 different species, who all thought they were correct about everything. Humans were becoming known for their ability to recognize a pointless argument and their wisdom to stay completely out of it. The communication system crackled to life. A voice from Crosspoint 9 traffic control came through the speakers. The controller informed Jake that the Wandering Star was cleared for departure. He was authorized to leave the station. Jake confirmed the message and began the departure sequence. The docking clamps released with a metallic clunk. The Wandering Star lifted gently away from the station on maneuvering thrusters. Through his viewport, Jake could see the massive structure of Crosspoint 9 growing smaller as his ship moved away. He could also see another security team rushing toward the bar district. The flashing lights of their vehicles were visible even from this distance. The philosophical debate had clearly escalated into physical violence once again. Captain Uralnox was probably very angry right now. Jake shook his head in amusement. He engaged the faster-than-light drive. The ship's engines hummed with building energy. Space around the Wandering Star began to shimmer and distort. Then, with a flash of light, the ship jumped to hyperspace. Behind him, dozens of alien species continued their heated argument about water and wetness. Each one was absolutely convinced they were right. Each one was willing to fight to defend their position. And none of them would ever change their minds or admit they might be wrong. But one human, having learned the painful lessons of Earth's long history, simply went about his business. He had cargo to deliver. He had credits to earn. He had a simple life hauling boxes between planets. It was not glamorous work. It was not exciting. But it was honest and it kept him alive, and that was enough. Jake Martinez knew that some battles were not worth fighting. He knew that some questions did not need answers. He knew that sometimes the smartest thing a person could do was absolutely nothing at all. The wandering star sailed through hyperspace toward its next destination. Jake settled back in his pilot's seat and closed his eyes for a moment. The ship's autopilot would handle the journey. He had several hours before he needed to do anything. He thought about the aliens still fighting in that bar. He thought about all the species in the galaxy, who were so certain of their own correctness. And he thought about humanity's place among the stars. Maybe humans were not the strongest or the smartest, but they had one advantage that many aliens seemed to lack. They knew when to shut up and walk away. That might not sound like much, but in a galaxy full of species who would rather fight than admit uncertainty, it was everything. 3 weeks after the bar fight, Jake Martinez was back on Crosspoint 9 station. His cargo delivery had gone smoothly. He had picked up a new job that required him to pass through the station again. This time he was hauling medical supplies to a colony on the outer rim. The pay was decent and the work was straightforward. Jake needed to refuel his ship and restock his supplies. The station had the best prices in this sector for both. So he docked the Wandering Star in Bay 7 again, the same bay as before, and headed into the station. He walked through the familiar corridors toward the commercial district. The station was busy as always. Aliens of every imaginable species moved through the halls. Merchants called out advertisements for their goods. Children of various species ran past, playing some game that crossed language barriers. Life on Crosspoint 9 continued as it always did. Jake passed the bar district and paused. He was curious about the celestial watering hole. Had they finished the repairs? Was the bar open again? He decided to walk past and check. He had no intention of going inside. He just wanted to see if the place had recovered from the damage. As he approached the bar, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. There was a large sign posted outside the entrance. The sign was written in Galactic Standard and several other major languages. It was impossible to miss. The sign read, "Philosophical debates about whether water is wet are strictly forbidden in this establishment. Any patron who raises this topic will be immediately ejected and permanently banned. No exceptions. By order of station management." Jake smiled when he read the sign. At least someone had learned something from the incident. He wondered how many other bars on the station had posted similar warnings. Probably most of them by now. As he stood there reading, the bartender emerged from inside. The old Quelxian recognized Jake immediately. His 6 eyes brightened and he waved several of his arms in greeting. He called out to Jake by name and invited him inside. Jake hesitated. He had supplies to buy and a schedule to keep. But the bartender seemed genuinely pleased to see him. And Jake had to admit he was curious about how the bar looked after the repairs, so he accepted the invitation and followed the Quelxian inside. The celestial watering hole looked completely different. Everything had been repaired and upgraded. New tables, new chairs, new lighting. The damaged viewport had been replaced with a larger one that gave an even better view of the stars. The bar itself gleamed with polish. The bartender explained that the insurance payout had been generous. He had used the money to make improvements that he had been putting off for years. In a strange way, the fight had actually helped his business. The new equipment was attracting more customers. Jake sat at the bar in the same spot as before. The bartender poured him a drink without asking what he wanted. It was the same terrible whiskey as last time. Jake accepted it with thanks and took a sip. It still tasted awful, but somehow that was comforting. The bartender told Jake that he had become something of a legend on the station. Word had spread about the human who sat calmly through an entire bar brawl without getting involved. Other species were talking about it. Some thought Jake was wise, others thought he was a coward. But everyone agreed that his behavior was unusual. Jake shrugged. He did not care what others thought. He had done what made sense to him. Fighting over whether water was wet seemed like the definition of stupidity. He had no regrets about staying out of it. The bartender leaned in closer and lowered his voice. He said that reporters from several galactic news networks had tried to interview people who were at the bar that night. They wanted to know about the fight. But more specifically, they wanted to know about Jake, the human who knew the answer to the water question but refused to share it. Jake groaned. He hoped this story would die quietly, but apparently it was spreading across the galaxy. Great. That was exactly what he needed. Fame for being smart enough not to get involved in other people's arguments. The bartender asked the question that everyone apparently wanted to know. Did Jake really know whether water was wet or not? Or had he just said that to avoid the argument? Jake took a long drink before answering. He said that the truth was complicated. On Earth, people had been arguing about this question for decades. There were valid arguments on both sides. The answer depended on how you defined wetness. It depended on whether you were talking about individual water molecules or bodies of water. It depended on your frame of reference. The real answer, Jake explained, was that there was no single correct answer. The question itself was flawed. It was designed to create argument, not to seek truth. And the smartest response to such a question was not to answer it at all. The bartender considered this carefully. Then he said something that surprised Jake. He said that humans were teaching the galaxy an important lesson. For thousands of years, different species had been so certain of their own correctness that they refused to consider other perspectives. Wars had been fought over philosophical differences. Trade agreements had collapsed over semantic arguments. But humans, who were new to galactic society, were showing a different way. They questioned their own assumptions. They recognized that some debates had no winners. They understood that sometimes the best answer was to admit uncertainty and move on. Jake had never thought about it that way. He had simply acted according to what he learned growing up on Earth. Do not fight battles you cannot win. Do not waste time on pointless arguments. Focus on what matters. These were basic survival skills where he came from. But maybe, the bartender suggested, those survival skills were exactly what the galaxy needed. Maybe humans would help other species learn to let go of their certainty. Maybe they would help create a more peaceful galactic community. Jake finished his drink and smiled. That was a nice thought, but he suspected it would take more than a few humans refusing to fight about water to change thousands of years of galactic culture. Still, it was a start. As he prepared to leave, the bartender told him one more thing. He said that Jake would always drink for free at the celestial watering hole. Any human smart enough to stay out of that fight deserved a lifetime discount. It was the least the bartender could do. Jake thanked him and headed back out into the station. He had supplies to buy and a ship to prepare. The medical supplies he was hauling were time-sensitive. Sick people on the outer rim were counting on him to deliver on schedule. As he walked through the corridors, he passed a group of aliens having an animated discussion. He could not help but overhear part of their conversation. They were arguing about whether light had mass. The debate was getting heated. Voices were rising. Jake kept walking. Not his problem, not his argument. He had learned his lesson well. Let them fight about light if they wanted to. He had deliveries to make. The wandering star was waiting for him in the docking bay. Jake loaded his supplies and ran through his pre-flight checks. Everything was in order. The ship was ready to leave. He strapped into the pilot's seat and requested departure clearance from traffic control. As the ship lifted away from the station, Jake thought about the conversation with the bartender. Maybe humans really were bringing something new to the galaxy, not advanced weapons or incredible technology. Just the simple wisdom of knowing when to shut up and mind your own business. It was not a glamorous contribution to galactic civilization. Nobody would write epic poems about humans who refused to fight over water. There would be no monuments built to honor those who stayed out of pointless arguments. But maybe that was okay. Maybe the galaxy did not need more heroes and warriors. Maybe it needed more people who knew how to walk away. Maybe it needed more beings who understood that some battles should never be fought in the first place. Jake engaged the faster-than-light drive and jumped to hyperspace. The stars stretched and blurred around him. The wandering star sailed toward the outer rim and its cargo of medical supplies. Behind him, Crosspoint 9 Station continued its endless cycle of trade, debate, and occasional violence. Somewhere on that station, aliens were probably still arguing about water, or light or gravity, or any of 1,000 other topics that had no clear answers. They would argue with passion and certainty. They would insult each other's intelligence, and eventually they would probably start fighting. But one human had learned to see through the foolishness. One human had learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is nothing. Sometimes the bravest choice is to walk away. And sometimes the greatest wisdom is knowing that you do not have to have an opinion about everything. Jake Martinez, cargo hauler, continued his journey through the stars. He was not a hero. He was not a genius. He was just a man who knew how to mind his own business. And in a galaxy full of species who could not stop fighting over nothing, that made him something special. The wandering star disappeared into the darkness of hyperspace. The debate about water and wetness continued without him. The galaxy kept turning, and Jake kept hauling cargo, one delivery at a time, living proof that sometimes the best way to win is simply not to play the game.